Hi everyone, like Dr. Rebecca said, my name is Zoe Padelopoulos. My research is on history and reconciliation, focusing on women's and LGBT experiences in Texas classrooms. Today I'm going to talk about my thesis, Texas education and Texas education, history education, and then reconciliation, and then my analysis of narratives. In the summer of 2021, Texas made national news for new education legislation and anti-trans legislation. These new bills restrict how current events in America's history, racism, and gender can be taught in Texas schools, as well as requiring that student athletes play on sports teams that correspond with the sex listed on their birth certificate. Texas politicians have also looked into banning books, which targets books with themes of queer sexuality and race. Additionally, Governor Greg Abbott released an opinion statement that said medical treatments provided to transgender kids should be considered child abuse. Texas is not alone in enacting legislation like this, and other states have gone even further. The U.S. has seen an increasingly polarized government, which turns children's books into leftist propaganda and schools into political minefields. However, as schools are a site of conflict, they can also be a site of conflict resolution. While conflict resolution and reconciliation are long-term processes and are therefore difficult to measure, education, and history education in particular, has the potential to be a site of reconciliation. My research argues that the current narrative presented in approved text for Texas public schools prevents and is even intentionally designed to resist reconciliation around issues related to social justice. So first, what is the purpose of history education? History education aims to promote social understanding and civic efficacy, so students who will one day become voting citizens will be equipped to make informed and reasoned decisions about issues of their state and nation. To do so, history education should develop students' historical thinking and reasoning skills so students can distinguish facts from opinion, detect biases, and critically evaluate multiple perspectives. So students should get writing, research, and critical thinking skills out of their history classes. History education can also be a way for students to recognize and connect with their cultural roots, identity, and heritage. Through this, history education has the ability to shape our identity in dynamic ways, not only in how we understand ourselves, but in how we are understood by others. History classrooms are then an institutional context where young people can learn about the past of their people and identities, discuss harder topics such as race and inequality, and make connections between the past and present. However, that is only possible if history narratives reflect the complexity and diversity of history, instead of the dominant group's perspectives, norms, and values. Of course, the past is so vast that not everything can be included in history textbooks, but the very decisions of what to include and what to leave out of textbooks speak volumes about what the dominant group wants students to learn. Students cannot learn everything, but they can, for example, learn a white male-centric version of American history. So Texas education is run by the State Board of Education, or the SBOE, which is a democratically elected body of 15 members who adopt rules and establish policies regarding education. History textbooks are presented to the SBOE by publishers for approval before they are printed. But by focusing on ideological disagreements between ultra-conservatives, conservatives, and liberals, there is no place for the principles of history education. Instead, we get a long list of names, dates, and events to memorize, and even if they include women and people of color, is that helping? When the history standards were rewritten in 2010, which were the same classes that I took in high school and what high school students are learning now, the Thomas Foley Institute, a conservative think tank, gave the Texas standards a D for being a politicized distortion of history, unwieldy, troubling, and containing misrepresentations at every turn. As history classes are not currently fulfilling basic purposes of history education, perhaps a switch to a more reflective and reconciliation-based history is what the state needs. When talking about reconciliation, it is important to acknowledge that reconciliation is complicated. As a long-term social process, reconciliation is usually discussed in terms of societies transitioning from violent conflict to peace and democracy, where groups involved in conflict come together to move forward. For examples, you can think post-World War II Germany, South Africa post-apartheid, Serbia and Bosnia, among many other countries. To begin reconciliation, people must first identify and acknowledge what happened between different groups, a process called truth-telling. Once this truth has been acknowledged, an effort to right the wrongs that occurred, or justice, must be made, and perpetrators must be shown forgiveness or mercy. Sometimes reconciliation can be more formal. In South Africa, truth commissions were held. However, history education has also been studied as a site of reconciliation. Previous studies on reconciliation through history education assume that history textbooks are curated dominant narratives. Although these narratives are presented and often received as neutral or objective accounts of facts, textbooks are used as ideological tools to promote the values, norms, and beliefs of the dominant group, and to legitimize the established political and social order that the dominant group benefits from. Studies have looked at reflective, multi-perspective, and multi-narrative textbooks as ways to promote reconciliation because of their focus on truth-telling. Offering multiple narratives then gives students the chance to explore perspectives different from their own. While students might not accept alternate narratives, they have the opportunity of at least understanding others, which is the first step towards reconciliation. Reflective textbooks encourage readers to think for themselves about the causes of events, and even to ponder on how to prevent the same thing from happening again. Additionally, collective memory scholarship shows that representations of the past are often characterized by blind spots and omissions when the dominant group writes the minority group out of the narrative. Multi-perspectivity allows for these blind spots to be filled and for minority groups to be represented. What is left in versus what is left out in textbooks is crucial because implicit messages about belonging are transmitted to students by the knowledge presented as legitimate in school. The multi-narrative and multi-perspective approach does not try to blend perspectives into one history, but offers narratives side by side. Because this approach aims at exposing differences, it can potentially further polarization between groups. But ignoring the past is also contributing to polarization, so it is potentially more beneficial to confront and acknowledge the past and experiences of others, as finding the truth and coming to terms with the past is essential for reconciliation. So for my research, I used textbooks approved for 11th grade history classes, so what students take their junior year of high school. I used two textbooks, U.S. History since 1877, which is on the screen here, and then The Americans, which is this textbook here. I specifically looked at the narratives of women's and LGBT plus history in the books. I compared both books to each other and to other non-high school materials to see what these books were saying, and more importantly not saying, about these groups. I also used a discourse analysis lens, which helps to illustrate how textual and social processes are connected, and to describe the implications of this connection for how people can act. Also, discourse analysis allows for the examination of the knowledge-power nexus, which assumes a binary power relationship where one element in the binary is privileged and controls the hegemonic discourse, which is important for talking about textbooks with dominant narratives. So first I'll talk about women's history narratives. Women's history in the two textbooks largely revolves around subjects of arts, activism and social movements, and war. Women typically have their own separate subsections that describe women's rights or women in organized labor that then focus on the arts activism and war. At these points, women's narratives would either give a brief overview of women at the time or talk about specific women deemed exceptional enough to be included in the book. Also, when books would mention women, they usually refer to white middle-class women's experiences, which are hardly universal. The experiences of Black women, Latino women, Native American women, and Asian women are largely ignored in both women's history and in sections of Black history or Latinx history, for example. If they are mentioned, it is typically throwaway lines that add little information or context. So I'll give a more in-depth example, talking about women's experiences after World War II. The post-war period saw the return of political conservatism, traditional gender roles, and the revival of domesticity, but there was still progress at the same time. History since 1877 didn't really have that much detail about women's experiences after World War II. It mentions that during the war, women joined the workforce and that afterwards they were either laid off or left their jobs voluntarily. Other than that, it mentions that there were high poverty levels amid prosperity, which included single mothers, the elderly, minorities such as Puerto Ricans and Mexican immigrants, and rural Americans. Then it skipped to second wave feminism with little context. The narrative the textbook The Americans follows does a bit of a better job. It includes rising divorce rates, suburbia with the ideal housewife, which is what the quote from Carol Freeman talks about. Then women wanting to keep the independence they had gained in the war, but ultimately still giving up jobs, and then their return to jobs in the 60s, with limited opportunities like nursing, teaching, and office work. But women's experiences are more complex than that. In a post-war culture that encouraged individualism and personal ambition, but also wanted women to be happy housewives, women saw contradictory messages about what they could do. We see advertisements like this one on the screen in textbooks promoting items like vacuum cleaners, clearly showing women as the ideal housewife. But these items weren't necessarily freeing for women, like the books say. Yes, they could make work easier, but that doesn't mean there's any less to do. Additionally, these items still put women in the household and reinforce domestic roles and the division of labor. However, this was also the ideal for middle-class white women. Reality was different for single mothers, women of color, and working-class women. In addition, the books do not mention that birth control became accessible in the 60s, even though not to everyone, which was huge for women because they could start to reliably control their family size. More women were also getting education, and there was an increased participation of married women in the labor force who either returned to work or were working for the first time after their children went to school. Women also fought to move to high-paid professions and more skilled professions outside of traditional jobs like teaching or nursing. So next I'll discuss a little bit about LGBT plus history. The narrative presented of LGBT plus history in textbooks was much shorter than for women's history. There were only 4 points when this history was told explicitly. World War II under the persecution of the Nazis, which was also the first mention of queer people existing, then AIDS, activism, and civil rights. For example, each textbook gave 1 paragraph to activism. The American starts during the 1970s and 80s, gay men and lesbians began to fight openly for civil rights. So in only 5 sentences, this book sums up LGBT plus activism, but contributing nothing to the narrative except the existence of queer people. History since 1877 starts. AIDS increased the visibility of the country's gay and lesbian community, but some homosexuals have been engaged in efforts to defend their civil rights since the 1960s. On June 27, 1969, New York City police raided a nightclub called the Stonewall Inn. In 6 sentences, this book gives its version of history. The history the books offer is inconsistent with dates. One book mentions Stonewall and one doesn't. But Stonewall is hardly the third act of resistance. The books could have mentioned Compton's cafeteria riot, which happened 3 years earlier. However, this riot was in response to police harassment of drag queens and transgender people, a group neither textbook mentions at all. Both books also offer a picture, one of a protest march and one of the AIDS quilts, but nowhere do students learn what people were protesting against or what their goals were. There were also several times when the textbook was silent in specific moments where LGBT plus history could be mentioned. One of the moments that stood out the most because of how the passage was written is a description of Greenwich Village and Harlem in the 1920s. When talking about 1920s New York, History since 1877 says, artists, writers, and intellectuals flocked to Greenwich Village and Chicago's South Side. The artistic and unconventional or bohemian lifestyle of these places allowed artists, musicians, and writers greater freedom of expression. However, it was the very bohemian aspect of the village that encouraged the toleration of unconventional forms of sexual expression and identity. But people clearly capitalized on this tolerance to claim their right to participate in village affairs, firmly establishing their presence in the village by the early 1920s. Gay men and lesbians opened their own clubs, speakeasies, restaurants, and tea rooms where they could meet, although they were not the only patrons of these businesses. The village became well known for its free living lifestyle, as well as its queer reputation, which made it a tourist hub for the rich and middle class from other parts of New York. As with the village, the contributions of queer people in Harlem were disregarded and excluded. Both textbooks offer a similar narrative of Harlem. History since 1877 says that when African Americans migrated from the rural South to the North, nightclubs and music filled these cities, particularly the New York neighborhood of Harlem. Artistic development, racial pride, and political organization combined in a flowering of African American arts. There is no mention of Harlem as an extensive gay world built by black gay men and women, or its complexity due to segregation. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said parents want their students to learn how to think critically, not to be indoctrinated by the ridiculous leftist narrative that America and our Constitution are rooted in racism. But students are already being indoctrinated through history education, just with a narrative that Dan Patrick wants to defend. Women's historical narrative told in these textbooks keeps women in certain parts of history, art, activism, and war, and sanitizes it. The focus on white middle-class women excludes the varied experiences of women of color and working-class women, and queer women whose narratives are no less important or indicative of American history. The LGBTQ+ narrative is even worse. It is buried there. The legacy of this history is one of suffering and silence in these books, when the community has a rich history that encompasses so much more. This lack of context, multi-perspectivity, and truth-telling prevents both the basic purposes of history education, reflection, and reconciliation through history narratives. But Texas history education can still be a step towards acknowledgement and reconciliation if changes are made to move towards truth-telling and multi-perspectivity to better reflect the historical narratives of the states.
And then we'll open the floor to questions.
private companies like McGraw-Hill who create the narratives and then publish and then get picked up later?
I think it would probably have to start with the SBOE because they can control everything that goes into the textbooks. So like when the publishers come to them, they have the ability to be like, you have to take this like section out, or you have to like change these words in the textbook. So it would probably have to start with the SBOE, which is democratically elected, which makes it a little bit trickier. But I think to start with like be making changes so that like people who are on the board like have like, an education, like in background. Because at the moment like anyone can come off the board. So in the past it's been like the dentist and like random stuff like that. And I feel like with someone who's like an appreciation for history, it's a change. But that is also really good. So just say.
We have time for maybe one more.
What were some of the limitations you came across?
So some of the limitations included the textbooks I could read. I had like difficulty like just finding or like getting these two textbooks. But like looking at textbooks for AP classes, that students also have stable like dual credit classes would also like give an interesting comparison.